Hi everybody, welcome to the pre-Pesach session at WebYeshiva. My name is David Sedley. I'm going to speak about Urchatz. Now, the people at WebYeshiva, the lovely people at WebYeshiva, looked at the list of 14 things on the Seder and they said, Sedley, let's give them a non-speaking part. Urchatz is the one part of the Seder where we don't say anything at all. We do an action. Well, that's not quite true. But anyway, there's no speaking, and not only that, but really it's just a preamble to the Karpas. But I'm not allowed to speak about Karpas because that in an hour there's another shiur on Karpas, which I'm sure will be excellent. So I'm going to try and limit myself to Urchatz. So first, the order of the Seder, just to put this in context, right? Urchatz is right near the beginning. We say Kaddish, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, Magid, Rochza, Motzi Matzah, Maro, Korech, Shulchan Aruch, Tzafon, Barech, Hallel, Nirtzah. So I have a few questions. Urchatz means and wash, I guess. So I have some questions which, if I'm lucky, I will be able to answer by the end of this hour. The first one is a technical question. Why are we washing our hands? We're used to the idea of washing our hands before we eat bread, or even washing our hands before you have matzah. Thank you, Lynn. I didn't even pay attention that I've got 4 questions. That's excellent. I should have changed that to the 4 questions on Urchatz. So question 1, why are we washing our hands? That's just a technical halachic question. Number 2, if we're already washing our hands, why are we not reciting a bracha? But then 3 and 4, I guess a little bit like the 4 parshiot, where 3 and 4 are connected together always. Why is it Urchatz and not just Urchatz or Rachatz or something like that? Why is there an and connecting it? And if we're going to connect Urchatz to something else, we should really connect it to Karpas, because the washing our hands comes before the Karpas. It's not connected to the Kadesh, which is Kiddush at the beginning. So it should be Kadesh, Rachatz, or Karpas. Now, the observant among you, I see my internet fell out. The observant among you will notice that all of the words in the, let me just go back, all of the words in the order of the Seder have 2 syllables. 2 of them have 2 words with 2 syllables each. So Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, if we just had a 1-syllable word for washing hands, it wouldn't scan, the song wouldn't work. So that is the trite answer, and it's probably not an incorrect answer to say that Urchatz has to be 2 syllables because all of the words in this list are 2 syllables. It's also the answer to every question about Pesach or one possible answer is that we do it so that the children will ask questions. So we use a strange word, and the kids say, wow, that's a strange word. And then you say, yes, because our ancestors were slaves in Egypt and God brought us out of there. So everything is so that the kids will ask questions, sometimes not even the kids, sometimes the adults. But just in case they ask, hopefully I'll give you some answers. So again, I want to look at the halachic aspect of why we wash our hands and why we don't break a bracha, and then why the vav connecting Kadesh rather than connecting it to Karpas. I may or may not answer those questions by the end, but let's see. So we are familiar with washing our hands for bread, although obviously during Pesach we don't wash our hands for bread, but wash our hands for matzah. So why do we wash our hands before we eat bread or matzah? I guess if anyone has any answers to that question, I'd be happy to see them in the chat. If you have thought about why we wash our hands, I know it's what we do. Before I give you answers, okay? Well, yes. Okay, so the Gemara says, this is one of the 18 decrees. If you remember, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, famous for arguing, and Beit Hillel usually was the majority, and usually the halacha was like Beit Hillel. But there was one occasion I'm sure I've spoken about this in one of my other classes, but on one occasion, Beit Shammai, well, the nice version of the story is that Beit Shammai noticed they were the majority, and so while they had the majority, they quickly passed through a whole lot of legislation before Beit Hillel could notice. That's the expurgated version of the story in the Midrash. It says that Beit Shammai kind of did a coup and took over the Beit Midrash. They wouldn't allow the Beit Hillel people to enter, and that's how they got the majority. And another version of the Midrash says that actually they were standing there with swords and potentially killing people to make sure they had the majority. Anyway, when they had this majority, they passed 18 rabbinic rules, the Urchatz Davar, as it is known. One of those rules was that you have to wash your hands before eating bread/matzah. So the Gemara says, what's the reason? Hayadayim. Why do we wash our hands before we eat? Mipnei shayadayim askaniot hen. Because the hands are busy. Because, well, I don't want to give away the answer, but you never know where your hands have been, basically. So that's why we wash our hands. Now, what does it mean that our hands are busy? So what? So what? I didn't have time to translate the sources, I'm afraid. You have to trust me as I go. So Rashi gives two explanations here. Askaniot hen, v'nogim b'bsaro, or b'makom t'nofet, right? So our hands touch our bodies and they touch dirty things. V'ganai l'truma b'kach. And it's not appropriate to handle teruma. Teruma is one of the gifts given to the Kohanim, right? It's inappropriate to handle truma with dirty hands. And it makes the food disgusting, unpleasant, not nice if you touch them with hands that are dirty. So according to this first explanation of Rashi, really you should wash your hands with soap and water before you eat a meal. And I strongly endorse that. If you're asking my advice, you should definitely wash your hands with soap and water before touching any food or putting your hand anywhere near your mouth. And I mean, luckily, unfortunately, we learned that over the last couple of years, and we had songs for singing to wash our hands for 20 seconds, and we're all about washing our hands. That's reason one for washing our hands. I want to come back to Truma in a bit. V'rabotenu mefarshim, but the rabbis explain, so that was first answer was Rashi's answer. The rabbis explain, chayshinan shemen nagu yadav betum'ah. Maybe your hands touched something impure. There's many things that could be impure, but most likely here we're talking about a dead mouse, for example. Impure. So your hands became impure, v'nitma, and once your hands became impure, then you don't want to touch your food with impure hands. For Rashi says, though, right, if we're worried about touching a dead mouse, v'kashali, I have a problem, says Rashi, imken, nichu shemen naga ba'av hatuma. If we're worried about touching impure things, maybe you didn't touch, well, actually, that's not true. Dead mouse is an avatuma, but maybe you touched something that is so impure that nimtza rishon v'it me'ena, that you will then make the bread impure when you touch it. Vod ma'ishna yadayim lechude, and also, why are we only worried about hands when we're talking about impurity, right? B'chol kufa nigzor lefsol truma. Maybe you should make you go to the mikveh before every time you want to have a piece of bread. Wash your whole body. Why is only the hands worried about? Shemen hagu yadav b'tumah v'nijma kol gufo. V'od lo tizkilo b'natila ela b'tevila. Furthermore, if you want to purify your hands, washing them even with a cup is not going to be enough to purify your hands. So you'd have to dip your hands in a mikveh. So anyway, we'll leave Rashi's questions for the time being, or in fact, we'll leave them completely for tonight. But Rashi has two answers as to why we wash our hands before we eat bread. One is because your hands might be dirty, and the second answer is because your hands might be impure. Now, Rashi mentioned here teruma. Nobody nowadays eats teruma, even if somebody is a Kohen, even if somebody is a Kohen, they don't eat truma nowadays. We're all impure. We're impure because of contact with a corpse. The food is impure. We don't have truma nowadays. In the time of the Kohanim, right? If you've learned the first Mishnah in Brachot, you know that the Kohanim would go to the mikveh before eating truma. And furthermore, truma was not only about bread or matzah, but about fruits and vegetables and all sorts of things that the Kohanim ate. So why are we washing our hands before bread if we're worried about truma, right? So why are people not Kohanim washing their hands? Why are we washing our hands when we're impure anyway? It's kind of Rashi's question. And why is it only for bread and not for everything else? And I think the answer is, I don't really have a source for this, but I think the answer is that when, right, we have many decrees, particularly of Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, decrees about when the temple will be rebuilt, that we do things now so that when the temple is rebuilt, we'll be accustomed to doing things, or we won't make a mistake, or be ready to do certain things. So I always understood that in terms of purity and impurity, the reason we wash our hands before eating bread is as a reminder for everybody that when the temple is rebuilt and when we have purity and impurity back, and when we have truma back and people eating truma, then the Kohanim will need to wash their hands before they eat their truma. That's a reminder to everybody. Partly we don't know who a Kohen is and who isn't, but also if it was only the Kohanim who do it, it probably would have been forgotten over the generations. If everyone does it, that reminds us that there will be a temple, that there will be Kohanim, there will be truma. But they only made it for bread because it's as a reminder. It will be unfeasible to do it for every food we ate. And I think that might be the answer to Rashi, why it's not why we don't have to go to the mikveh, but only wash our hands, and why it doesn't really work in terms of truma and tahara, in terms of impurity, because it's a reminder. It's both a reminder of what will happen and a reminder that the temple is destroyed, and we haven't got that haven't got that opportunity nowadays. That's my understanding. So again, Rashi, answer number one, because our hands are dirty, we should just wash them with soap and water. Answer number two, because we want to think about ritual purity. So the Gemara in Brachot says a different answer than Rashi. That previously was the Gemara in Shabbat, or Rashi on Shabbat. The Gemara in Brachot says a different answer. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Right, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Ana lo zilai velo hizivai velo zehumai. So the Gemara discussed different reasons for washing hands before food. Right, so I don't hold of any of those answers. Right, Laidana ela masnitin yadana. I know a braita, and the braita is as follows. Right, a braita is something from the time of the Mishnah that was left out of the Mishnah. I know a braita as follows. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said the name of Rav, which is strange because Rav Yehuda lived after the time of the Mishnah, as so did Rav, although Rav is, anyway, never mind. V'amar le'menita Tana. Others say it was taught in a braita. V'hit kadishtem. You shall sanctify yourself. We're going to read that in a few weeks' time. A general principle, you should sanctify yourself. Now the braita understands, Elu mayim rishon. That refers to the water, to washing your hands before you eat. V'yitem kedoshim, and you shall be holy. Elu mayim achronim. That is the water you wash after you've eaten, your mayim achronim. Ki kadosh, because you are holy. Zeh shemen. Nowadays, many people don't do mayim achronim at all. Back in the time of the Gemara, they did mayim achronim, wash their hands, then they put some oil on their hands to make their hands smell nice after eating. Ani Hashem Elokechem zo bracha, and then I am the Lord your God refers to the blessing. So washing hands before eating your meal is part of sanctifying yourself. In other words, the act of eating is a holy act. We're not eating because we're hungry. We're not eating because we're gluttons. We're not eating because there's some delicious new flavor of ice cream we want to try. We're eating as an act of holiness so that we can have the energy and the focus and the right blood sugar levels to serve God in the best way. So when we wash our hands, we remind ourselves that we're purifying it, not purifying in that sense, sanctifying it, right? We're doing this in a way for sanctification, which is kind of a meta halacha thing. Again, why is it only for bread and not for anything else? Well, because bread was certainly the main part of the meal. People would eat a meal. I don't know if you've been to a hummus in Israel. When you eat hummus, you take the pita. You don't use a knife and fork or spoon. You take the hummus and you take the pita and you eat your hummus with the pita. And when it was not Pesach, it would be a regular pita. And when it was Pesach, it would be a slightly thinner or a slightly quicker made pita to eat the hummus. In other words, their meals were eaten not with knives and forks, which are much later inventions, but with bread. And that's why it's on the bread that we sanctify ourselves, wash our hands beforehand. That's not a halacha in the sense of, the Torah, when it says kadishtem, the rabbis aren't saying that this is a Torah mitzvah to wash your hands. There's no question it's a rabbinic mitzvah of washing our hands. But what they're saying is we can find an allusion or a mnemonic or a way of remembering or explaining this mitzvah in this verse, an allusion in this verse to the mitzvah of washing our hands before we eat. Okay, so that's why we wash our hands before bread, because bread is the main part of a meal, and either because our hands are dirty, or because we want to think about purity, or because we want to sanctify ourselves, which is, I guess, goes with both the first two answers. But why do we wash our hands before we eat vegetables? So the Gemara says this as a halacha. Amar Reb Elazar, Amar Reb Oshia, Kol shetibulo b'mashke, anything which is eaten by dipping it in a liquid, and we're referring to the 7 liquids, which include water and oil and milk and wine, right? Anything which you're going to dip into liquid, tzarich netilat yadayim. You need to wash your hands before you do. Pesach, that every time you eat you take your celery and you dip it into some vinaigrette before you eat it, you have to wash your hands before you touch that celery. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands if you do that on a regular basis, or even if you've heard of that halacha. In fact, I expect that most people don't, including myself. But it's very clearly a halacha, as we'll see in the Shulchan Aruch, that you must wash your hands before eating any food that is dipped in liquid. I'm not going to get into the details of the halacha about whether it applies if you use a fork, for example. If you don't touch the food directly, but you just touch it with your chopsticks or your fork or your spoon or something else, do you still need to wash your hands or not? But the bottom line is probably you do, according to halacha. So answer to question 1, why do we wash our hands before eating the karpas? Answer is because that's what the halacha says. That just like you wash your hands before you eat bread or matzah, you must wash your hands before you eat something dipped in liquid. And the karpas, which I'm not allowed to talk about, is taking a vegetable or taking something and dipping it in some kind of liquid. Yeah, that's right. It's interesting that Rav Papa talks about chasa, which is lettuce, because we use lettuce for maror, not for karpas. And so really we should wash our hands. Well, not really, we do, right? When we have the maror, we've already washed our hands first for the matzah. By the time we get to maror, and then we dip it in the charoset, and so our hands are washed for that. But we also do it separately before eating the karpas. That's a very simple answer. We do it because that's what it says to do. Thank you. It wasn't a very useful answer, it was an answer. So why do we wash our hands, right? Why do we wash our hands before eating a vegetable dipped in liquid or anything dipped in liquid? We know that we wash our hands for eating bread because, as I said, cleanliness, purity, or sanctification. So Tosfot on that Gemara says, Kol shiblo b'mashke tzarich netila, v'nir'et netila tahacha lo mishum kedusha v'nekiyut, kama b'nahama. So Tosfot says here, it doesn't seem that we're washing our hands for the same reasons that we do before we eat bread, meaning sanctifying ourselves before eating it, or because we want our hands to be clean. But rather, there is a halacha, right? By default, this might get too technical. I'll try. I hope it doesn't. By default, our hands have the status of second-degree impurity because they're always wandering around, touching things, doing things. So the rabbi said your hands are always second-degree impurity. Something which is a second-degree impurity can make teruma impure, but it can't make regular food impure. However, anything which is wet, if your hands touch something wet, then magically, mystically, they go from being second-degree impurity, that liquid becomes first-degree impurity. It doesn't happen in any other case where something becomes more impure than the thing that caused it, but with liquids it does. And something which is first-degree impurity can then make food, any food, impure. So Tosfot says is that there's a real tuma tahara, purity, impurity reason we have to wash our hands before handling wet food, because our hands, which are at second-degree tuma, touch the liquid, which then becomes first-degree tuma, and that makes the food impure via asur lishtotan v'lefsol et gufo. It becomes then forbidden to drink the liquid, and that would make your whole body impure. Does that matter nowadays when we don't have purity or impurity? Not really. Is it a reminder for the temple? Maybe, but if we've forgotten to do it, then I guess it's not really a reminder. This is the halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, right? I know I'm quoting Gemara, and sometimes Gemara is halacha, sometimes it's not halacha, but if you open Shulchan Aruch, in the same section where he talks about before eating a meal, and he talks about washing your hands for bread, he says, Im ochel davar shetibu lo be'echad mishav shiva mashkin. If you eat something which is dipped in one of the 7 liquids, right? Shasimanam yad shachat dam, which stands for wine, honey, oil, milk, dew, blood, or water. V'loinit nagev, and you didn't dry the food that you're eating that is wet. Afilo ein yadav nogot b'makom hamashkeh. Even if, I don't know, you wash half an apple and your hands touch the dry part and not the wet part, tzarich netilah b'lo bracha. You have to wash your hands before touching that apple, but without reciting a bracha. Haga, the Ramah says, Ramosh Isles adds, Afilo eino mitavel rak rosh hayerek, or pri. Even if you only dip, you hold the end of the celery, and you dip the other end, right, into the liquid, so the liquid is nowhere near where your hands are. Even so, afilo hachi yitol b'lo bracha, you have to wash your hands without reciting a bracha. Now, the reason that we don't say a bracha, basically, we're going to see on the next slide, basically the reason we don't say a bracha is because it is a machloket rishonim, whether we say a bracha or not, and safek brachot lahakel, whenever there's a doubt about whether to say a bracha or not, meaning whenever there is a dispute, halachic dispute about whether to say a bracha or not, we don't say it. But the Mishnah Berurah explains, right, below bracha, Mishnah Berurah on this same halacha about washing before eating vegetables, right? Ki yesh miktzat harishonim tesvirei delo hitzricho chamim til yadayim ledevash tiblo b'mashkeh, right? That some of the Rishonim say that the rabbis only required one to recite a blessing over washing hands before eating something that was dipped in liquid. B'yamehem, in the time of the Mishnah, she'ochlim b'tahara, when they would eat their food in a state of purity, and then you would wash your hands out as a state of purity. But nowadays we're all impure. We're impure and the food is impure. Therefore we don't recite the blessing, because of the principle that if there's a doubt about the bracha, you don't recite the bracha. But hang on a second, says the Mishnah Berurah, that we quotes the Magen Avram, of Avram Gombiner, who quotes the Lechem Chamudot, who says that the minhag is we don't wash our hands, right? I'll put my hand up, we don't wash our hands before eating liquids, eating foods dipped in liquids. V'yeshem al mashi yismachu, and they have an opinion to rely on if they want to be lenient. Hainu niktzat rishonim hana, which meaning those rabbis, the Rishonim, who say that this rule only applied in the time when they had Tum and Tara and doesn't apply nowadays, or at least we don't say a blessing nowadays, that gets you off the hook if you're not washing your hands before your dipped celery. But many of the Achronim are very stringent about this. V'katvu da'ika karov poskim. The halacha is like the majority of the poskim, the tzarich netila medina, that you need to wash your hands. That's the halacha. Af bezman hazeh, even nowadays. V'ayim b'bar hagra shegam da'ato ken. And now the Mishnah Berurah is, I think I said this in one of my recent shiurim. Unlike, let's say, the Chai Adam, who was a Rav in Vilna, or the Aruch HaShulchan, their books are the halacha and the minhagim that they see around them, or like the Ben Ish Chai in Baghdad, or like the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in Hungary, or like the minhagim they talk about are minhagim that they see people doing. The Mishnah Berurah, who was not a shul rav and didn't really have any official position, he talks about minhagim he would like people to do. He is not inventing minhagim, but he's quoting sources to try and encourage people to take up customs. A custom, by definition, is something that people do, not something that you want them to do. But anyway, so here he's saying that many people say you have to wash your hands, and the Vilna Gaon, right? In terms of minhagim, the Mishnah Berurah is responsible, probably more than anybody else, for reintroducing the thought of the Vilna Gaon into the general discourse, so that nowadays there are a lot of people who follow the Vilna Gaon's opinions. Vilna Gaon also held no communal position and had very few students, didn't have yeshiva, and many of his customs kind of just went in a very small area. The Mishnah Berurah rediscovered, reinvigorated the Vilna Gaon. So he says, the Vilna Gaon says, I've gone off on a tangent, I'll come back to where I started. So Hagra Shigam Dato Ken. So the Vilna Gaon says also, you must always wash your hands before you eat wet food. He was very stringent about this. He said, Vilna Gaon says, you make a blessing before you wash your hands for your wet food. So it says in Mishnah Berurah, makes this compromise, even though the minhag is not to make a bracha, but you really cannot be lenient to eat without washing your hands. Right? Mishnah Berurah is very strict. You must wash your hands if you're having your washed apple. And you have to wash your hands in the same way that you do for bread. You have to have a container, you have to have a revier of water, you have to pour the water over both hands separately, you have to pour it using human force, all those things. However, if you're eating less than a kazayat of your vegetable, then, says the Mishnah Berurah, you don't have to be stringent about this, because even if you have bread, if you're having less than a kazayat of bread, you don't have to wash your hands. So certainly if you have less than a kazayat of vegetable, you don't have to wash your hands. Now, the more astute among you will point out, what about karpas? Karpas has to be less than a kazayat, right? Because we don't want to make a bracha achrona, we want to cover the maror in our bracha of ha'adama, and we don't want to make a bracha afterwards, so we make a point of having less than a kazayat of karpas. So therefore, the Mishnah Berurah says we shouldn't have to wash our hands before eating this karpas, because it's less than a kazayat. Good question. So we do it so the children will ask lots of questions. But if you're asking why don't we say a blessing when we wash our hand for the karpas, the answer is because a minority of Rishonim say that we don't have to wash our hands at all nowadays, and therefore we don't say a bracha, safek brachot lehakel. Some homes on Pesach have a custom that not everybody washes their hands for karpas, but only the leader of the Seder gets up and washes his hands, or they bring water to the table, or however you do it. So people don't wash their hands, only one person does. And that would be based on this last line of the Mishnah Berurah, which says that for less than a kazayat, you don't have to wash your hands at all. So therefore, we're doing it purely symbolically, so that the kids will say, "Why on earth are you washing your hands? That's a really weird thing to do. We don't normally do that." Except that you would normally do that every other day, according to the Mishnah Berurah, if you're having more than a kazayit. So the strange thing would be you're washing for less than a kazayit rather than washing for a kazayit. So why do we wash for karpas? I've got the wrong image here, so I'll just move on for a second. If we're not stringent normally to wash our hands, just by the way, when we're talking about hand washing and how the custom of what we do is different than what the halacha is, the halacha is very clear that washing your hands, right? Ma'im rishonim rishut, ma'im achronim chova. That if you only have enough water for either to wash your hands before you eat your bread or after your bread, the halacha says you should wash after eating bread. That's a more important mitzvah, to wash your hands ma'im achronim rather than to wash your hands beforehand. If you don't have water available, you don't have to wash before in certain circumstances, but you still have to wash ma'im achronim afterwards. And the reality of the world, as far as people I've met, is that people are much more stringent on washing their hands before eating bread than on washing their hands after eating bread before Birkat HaMazon. And sometimes when they do Ma'im Achronim, if they do, they only do a symbolic couple of drips of water rather than washing properly with a cup and or with soap and water in order to have clean hands. But that's an aside. Shulchan Aruch says, in terms of, we've now moved from the laws of hand washing to the laws of Seder. And the Shulchan Aruch says, you should wash your hands before the first dipping, which is going to be the karpas, which I'm not going to speak about. And don't make a bracha on that washing. Take less than a kazayit of the karpas. Dip it in vinegar, and then you make a bracha, you eat it, and you don't make a bracha afterwards, as I said, because we want to make sure you're all brachad up when you get to the maror, in case it's not covered by the hamotzi, which gets you into a machloket rishonim. Says the Taz, right? The Taz is the Turei Zahav. David, I forgot the name. David, can't remember. Never mind. He comments on this Shulchan Aruch. You wash your hands before you dip. Because, as we learned in the previous source, anything which is dipped in liquid, you have to wash your hands first. And he says, Mikan yesh tochacha megula. From here, we have a clear rebuke. It's a rebuke to those people who aren't careful the rest of the year to wash their hands before they eat something which is dipped in liquid. Do you like that little joke he did? What is the difference between this night and every other day of the year? And if you're going to say, yeah, but it's Pesach, I'm extra careful on Pesach. Pesach is all about doing weird, like being strict on halacha. If you're strict on Pesach night, on Seder night, to wash your hands before you eat something dipped in liquid, then you should also be careful, at least during the 10 days of repentance. When people take on extra stringencies, for example, being strict to only eat Pat Yisrael and not Pat Akum, bread made by a Jew during those 10 days. So if you're taking on extra things, at least the same thing you're doing on Seder night, you should do on the 10 days of repentance. But really, you should do it every day of the year. So Ela Vadai She'ein Kan Ela Chisron Zehirut. So he says it's just that people are not careful. People don't pay attention. And they're not paying attention to what they're doing. They're strict about washing their hands for karpas, and then the next morning, they've forgotten about it. The rest of the year, they forget about washing their hands before eating fruit or vegetable or any food that is dipped in liquid. So the Taz, not only the Taz, everybody says you must wash your hands before eating things that are dipped in liquid. So Shar, I spelled Shar wrong. How could I spell Shar wrong? S-H-A-R. Shar Tzion. This is written by the by the Mishnah Berurah, by the Chafetz Chaim. No, I can't say the name of the person, which is the name of a different book, by Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan. He comments on this Shulchan Aruch. Yesh me'achronim shekatvu da'afil atan she'eino nogim b'chol hashana litol yedehem ledavar she'tiburo b'mashkeh. Some people say that even those who aren't careful the rest of the year to wash their hands before dipping things in liquid. However, Hayom Yitzlu, today they should wash their hands. Why? Why are you being so frum on this one day? Is what the Taz asked. The answer is because the kids are going to say, hey, mum, dad, aunt, uncle, why are you washing your hands today for eating a vegetable when you don't do it every other day of the year? And you say, because Pharaoh, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt and God brought us out of there with an outstretched arm. So there's not really any excuse to not wash your hands before eating things dipped in liquid. I take that back. There will be an excuse coming up shortly. But the halacha is very clear. You must do it. The custom is also very clear that most people that I know of don't do it. Another reason why we might do it on Seder night and not any other time of the year comes from the Netziv. And in his Haggadah called Imre Shefer, he writes top of the page in the introduction the following idea, which really is guidance for the whole of the Seder night, a really beautiful idea, which I think explains a lot of things. He says, Hachanat HaSeder Shel Pesach, right, preparing the Seder of Pesach, Hinhigu Chazal Lasot Dugma, Kmo Shayu Noagim Be'eretz Yisrael B'zman Achila HaPesach. The rabbis set it up so that it would be the image of the modeled on the way people used to do things in Israel in the time of eating the Korban Pesach, when the temple was standing. Right? We start off the Seder by saying, anyone who needs, come and join us for the Korban Pesach. We don't have a Korban Pesach. We make a point of not having a Korban, right? We don't, some people are accustomed not to eat roast food, not to eat roast meat on Seder night, so you don't get confused and think it is a Pesach. Right? Others do the opposite. But nevertheless, we make a point of saying, when we point to the shank bone, we don't say this is the Korban Pesach, it's a reminder of the Korban Pesach, right? We don't want to get confused and make something into a Pesach, into a Paschal lamb that isn't. And yet, the very opening of the Seder is, anyone who needs a Korban Pesach, come and join us. So the Netziv says, that's because we're pretending, we're imagining, we're reenacting what it was like in the time of the temple. But we don't want to do it in a way that nullifies the mitzvah of eating matzah. So he goes through and explains why we're doing a Hillel sandwich and why are we doing everything in the Seder is a reenactment or a reminder of what they would have done in the time of the temple. So we wash our hands for karpas, right? Even though we don't normally do it the rest of the year, it's because we're not doing the halacha as we do it the rest of the year. We're reenacting what life was like for the Jews in Israel at the time of the temple and the Korban Pesach. I think that's a really beautiful and powerful idea that goes a very long way on Seder night. So to summarize, we wash our hands before bread, right? Either for cleanliness or for some kind of purity or for some kind of sanctification. We wash our hands before dipping them in liquid, is the halacha. Tosfot says because of purity and impurity, and the Taz says there's no excuse not to do that. And even though the Mishnah Berurah does find us an excuse, the Sha'ar Tzion, really we should. So why aren't we all washing our hands all the time before we eat things dipped in liquid? And the answer is one word, which is arrogance. I Googled arrogance and asked Google to find me a picture of arrogance, but then I thought, actually, the dictionary definition is just as good. Haughtiness, conceit, hubris, self-importance, egotism. Right? What does that mean? The Gemara in Chulin, of course. Gemara in Chulin. Am Rabbi Lazar. Am Rabbi Oshia. Lo amru natilat yadayim b'leferot, ele mishum nikiyut. So Rabbi Lazar says the reason you have to wash your hands before eating fruit, meaning any non-bread, is because you want clean hands. Wash your hands with soap and water, before you eat your lunch. Savomina chovahu deleka ha mitzvah ika. So, are you saying there's no obligation to wash your hands, but it's just a mitzvah to do that? If your hands are dirty, you should wash them, but there's no obligation to go and wash your hands. Amalahu rava la chova v'lo mitzvah ela rishut. There's no obligation at all to wash your hands, and it's not a mitzvah. It's just optional. If you want, you can wash your hands, and if not, not. Or pliki to Rav Nachman, Rav Nachman, I'll tell you, Davle Perot, eno elei b'gasei ruach. So Rava says very differently than the Shulchan Aruch and everything we've said until now, and he disagrees with Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says if you wash your hands before eating fruit, then you are being arrogant. Right? You're being arrogant. So what does that mean to be arrogant? If you do something which is not a mitzvah and not an obligation, but just optional, and you go and do that, but you're not really on that level, then you're just showing off, and you publicly go and do something that's not really who you are. Now, how does this fit in with everything else I'm talking about? This is talking about, simple reading at any rate, this is talking about dry fruit. Right? If you go and eat a dry banana, and you wash your hands first, then you're just showing off. Don't do that. Right? Rava says you can if you want, but Nachman says no, you can't do that even if you want to. But when we're talking about wet fruit, if everybody is doing that, of course you should do that too. What happens then if we're talking about a mitzvah that people don't do? Right? Something that you should do, but people aren't doing it. For example, the Gemara in Brachot talks about a chatan on his wedding night should not read Kriyat Shema because he won't be able to have the proper concentration for reading Shema. Yeah. Now, if you've ever been to a wedding and you've davened Marav, the chatan does say Shema, does daven, does do Shema, because for the chatan to say, well, I can't say Shema tonight because I'm not concentrating, would imply that every other day of the year they are concentrating appropriately when they say Shema. It's one of the things Rabbi Gamliel's students came to him and said, why are you saying Shema on your wedding night when you're not supposed to? He said, because I can't not say Shema. But nowadays it's the opposite. If we make a point of doing something that's not widely done, then we're showing off, oh, look at me, I'm so holy that, as if every other day I have intent and today I don't, which is not the case. Lynn says, do we not train ourselves to keep the habit, remember for that moment when the laws of the temple come into force, when the temple is restored, we are guiding those who will be suddenly affected by maintaining the custom as widely on display? Sure. I mean, I think that's why we wash our hands for bread. I agree with that. But if it's something that nobody is doing, and you're going to make a point, look at me, how religious I am, I'm doing this thing. One of the examples given is wearing your tzitzit. If you're a man, wearing your tzitzit over your clothes, everybody can see your tzitzit and how religious you are, having your tzitzit hanging out. But of course, nowadays, many men do that anyway, and therefore I guess it's not showing off to do that because that's what people do in certain society, even though the Mishnah Berurah says you should not have your tzitzit hanging out because it's showing off. But we don't care about the Mishnah Berurah sometimes, so many people do have their tzitzit hanging out. If women want to wear tzitzit, right, there's no prohibition on a woman wearing tzitzit, but if no other women are doing it, maybe it's showing off, maybe it's yuhara, maybe they're saying I'm somebody who I'm not. The halacha says that on Tisha B'Av, the Talmidei Chachamim should not work on Tisha B'Av, and there's a machloket in the Gemara in Ta'anit about whether that applies only to Torah scholars or anybody can be a Torah scholar on that day or not work. Right? There's a concern if you say, look at me, I'm so religious, I don't work on Tisha B'Av, then you've got to live up to that and everything as well. So maybe what we can say is that even though the halacha is that you should wash your hands before eating fruit, and it's strange to say this, but I still think this is the reality, that's the halacha. You've got to wash your hands before eating fruit. But if you're the person who goes and washes their hands before eating fruit, and that's that's what you do, but you don't live up to everything else, then people are going to say, look at this show off, look at this person who's gasei ruach, look at this person who is just taking a halacha that people aren't doing and showing how religious they are, but they don't live up to that in every other area of their life. So for sure, if you do live up to that in every other area of your life, you should be washing your hands before eating fruit. If you're doing it in private, maybe you should be washing your hands before you eat wet foods. But to make a public display of I need some water so I can wash my hands because I'm so religious, perhaps would be in the category of arrogant. So if that being the case, why then do we do it on Seder night? How come we're being so arrogant on Seder night and washing our hands when we don't do it the rest of the year? And according to the Mishnah Berurah, this is the time we don't have to wash our hands because we're eating less than a kazayat of the karpas. And that, I think, is the answer as to why we say Kaddish or Urchatz. That we first, I've got just a picture here, no text, that if we connect the washing to the sanctification, if we say Kaddish or Urchatz, we're saying we are not doing this because we're showing off. We're not washing our hands now because we've suddenly become so holy. We're not, as the Taz would say, it's not something we're going to do during the 10 days of repentance. We're not that holy. But we're doing it tonight because we've sanctified ourselves tonight to reenact the Haggadah, to reenact the Pesach story, to relive the Exodus from Egypt. And therefore we're doing this not to show off, not because we're holier than thou, not because we're so great or so religious or so strict about everything else, but we're doing this because we've sanctified ourselves for this night. So it's Kaddish or Urchatz, not Rachatz or Karpas, because that would make it seem as though we're washing our hands because we are washing our hands because of the Karpas. But we can do that without fear of arrogance because we've started with the Kiddush, with the Kadesh, sanctifying ourselves first, and then washing our hands in a way that we wouldn't normally do. And that's it. That's my message for Pesach. Wishing you all a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, even though it feels like a very long way away, and it will race up very, very quickly. It's not yet on the WebYeshiva website, but after Pesach, in the Pesach to Shavuot Zman, I will be giving 4 classes on Sfirat HaOmer, and more specifically on some of the ideas from the book Spheris, which I wrote with Rabbi Haber, which talks about the 7 midot. And, well, I guess come along to this year and find out what that's going to be. So look out for that on WebYeshiva. At some point soon they will post that. Exactly. Well, if you've read the book, Lynn, then you don't have to come to the classes. Or maybe you should give the class. But anyway, that will be, I'm going to fit 7 weeks into 4 weeks somehow between Pesach and Shavuot. Thank you all, everyone. Have a great break. Have a wonderful Pesach.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.